At 79, Ruth Ellison was thrown out of the house where she had spent 41 years making soup, folding laundry, paying bills on time, and believing that loyalty still counted for something. Her husband had been dead for 9 months. His son had waited only long enough for the casseroles to stop coming and the sympathy calls to dry up before arriving with a lawyer, 2 movers, and a court order that said the house had never really been hers. By noon, her winter coats were in black trash bags. Her medicine was in a shoebox, and the man she had once helped raise was telling her not to make this uglier than it has to be. If you've ever seen someone treated like they no longer matter just because they got old, stay with this story to the end. And if stories like this mean something to you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Because what Ruth found after losing everything was not money, not luck, and not mercy. It was something buried so deep that most people would have walked right over it and never known. Ruth did not argue on the porch. She had learned a long time ago that some people became calmer the crueler they were. Caleb stood near the mailbox in a pressed jacket, one hand in his pocket, the other holding papers, as if papers made him clean. He kept saying the same thing in different ways. Probate, legal transfer, limited options, temporary accommodation. He did not once say the words, "get out," but that was what every sentence meant. She took the 2 bags they allowed her, a dented metal cash box and the old quilt from the cedar chest upstairs. The movers shut the trunk of her Buick for her, as if they were doing a favor. One of them would not meet her eyes. The other said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry," so quietly it almost disappeared in the wind. Ruth drove away without knowing where she was going. By late afternoon, she was 2 counties out, running on half a tank and a headache pressing behind her eyes. She pulled into a gas station, bought coffee she did not want, and sat in the car, staring at a stand of pine trees beyond the road. That was when she remembered something her father had said once, maybe 30 years ago, maybe more. He had been fixing a fence post behind her childhood home, hat tipped low, voice flat the way it always got when he was talking about something he did not want repeated. "If life ever strips you clean," he had said, "go to the West Tract. There's old ground there that remembers our name better than people do." She had laughed at the time. He had not. The West Tract was 47 acres of woodland outside Belmere, most of it scrub oak, pine, and uneven ground no one in the family cared about because it had never been good for crops. After her mother died, Ruth's father kept paying the taxes on it without explanation. When he passed, the land went into her name so quietly that even Howard, her husband, had once called it that useless patch of timber. Ruth had not visited it in 16 years. She turned west before she could talk herself out of it. The road narrowed, then roughened, then became little more than 2 pale tire marks through weeds. Dusk settled early beneath the trees. Branches scraped the sides of the Buick. Once, she almost turned back. Then she saw the rusted gate hanging open on one hinge and the old boundary stone half buried in moss. Ellison was still cut into it, faint but visible. The cabin was worse than she remembered. One wall leaned. The porch had sunk on the left side. Half the roof was dark with rot. But it was standing, and tonight, standing was enough. Ruth carried her bags inside, one by one. The place smelled of wet wood, old ash, and long neglect. There was a table, a narrow cot frame without a mattress, 2 broken chairs, and a cast iron stove thick with dust. She found a bucket under the sink, a box of cloudy jars in the pantry, and 3 dry blankets sealed in a trunk so old the hinges cried when she opened it. It felt less like arriving somewhere than being tolerated by it. After dark, she sat on the porch wrapped in the quilt and listened to the woods settle around her. No traffic, no voices, no Caleb. No one telling her to hurry up and leave. Then, somewhere beyond the tree line behind the cabin, she heard it. Not an animal, not a branch falling. A hollow sound. One dull, heavy thud under the ground, as if something beneath the earth had just answered back. Ruth did not go into the woods that night. At 79, she still had enough sense left not to follow strange sounds into black timber with one flashlight, bad knees, and a dead phone battery. She barred the cabin door with the broken chair, slept in her coat on top of the quilt, and woke 3 times to every small sound the forest could make. By dawn, the fear had thinned into something more stubborn: curiosity. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped gently toward a patch of older pines where the undergrowth was thinner than it should have been. Ruth stood there with a chipped enamel mug in one hand and stared at the earth as if it might explain itself in daylight. At first, she saw nothing. Then she noticed the shape. A shallow dip in the ground, too rectangular to be natural, half swallowed by leaves and broom sedge. One side had old fieldstone peeking through the dirt. Someone had once cut this place clean and then hidden it. She went back for the rusted shovel from the shed. The first hour told her almost nothing, except that time had not improved her back. She scraped away matted leaves, roots, and 2 decades of pine needles. Underneath, the rectangle sharpened. There were timbers down there, old blackened ones, collapsed inward. By noon, she had uncovered the outline of what looked like a covered entrance sunk into the earth. Not a root cellar, too long, too deliberate. She sat on an overturned bucket to catch her breath, and remembered her father, once coming home with red clay packed on his boots clear to the ankle. Though there had been no planting done that week, he had washed those boots outside and said very little over supper. Ruth stood again and kept digging. By mid-afternoon, the shovel struck wood with a hard, deep knock. She cleared the dirt with her hands and found thick planks laid side by side over a narrow drop. Most had rotted soft at the edges, but the center still held. Iron rings were bolted into 2 of them, nearly hidden beneath rust and soil. She crouched lower, brushing away grit until her fingertips caught on a seam between the boards. A hatch. She sat back on her heels and stared at it. The forest had gone very quiet around her. Not silent exactly, just watchful. Fine, she muttered to no one. If you were hidden for a reason. She did not open it right away. She fetched the pry bar from the shed, a coil of clothesline from a kitchen drawer, and a father's old lantern from the pantry shelf. It still worked after 3 tries and a curse. Ruth tied the line around the nearest pine, looped the other end around her wrist because foolishness and caution sometimes live side by side, then wedged the pry bar beneath the hatch seam and leaned with all the weight she still had. Nothing. She reset her grip and tried again. The wood groaned. Dirt slid inward. On the 3rd try, one side lifted with a wet sucking sound, as if the earth itself had been holding it shut. Cold air rose from below. Not the smell of rot, something drier, older, still. Ruth raised the lantern and pulled the hatch back another foot. Below was a short stairway cut into packed clay and braced with timber. The steps disappeared into darkness that looked solid enough to lean against. She stood there long enough for good sense to make one final attempt to stop her. Then she took the lantern and started down. The dugout was bigger than the entrance suggested, almost the size of 2 rooms laid end to end. The ceiling beams were low but solid. Walls of hard-packed earth had been reinforced with boards, now darkened by age. Shelves lined one side, crates lined the other. In the far corner sat a narrow desk under a sheet of oilcloth, with 3 mason jars still standing on it, as if someone had meant to come back next week instead of 40 years later. Ruth moved slowly, lantern held high. The dust told its own story. No recent footprints, no animal nesting, no signs of vandalism. Whatever this place was, it had been sealed well, better than the cabin above it. She touched one crate and found lettering burned into the wood, faded but legible. E. County Ledgers. Another said, Maps/Deeds. Her pulse changed then, not faster exactly, but deeper. She pulled the oilcloth off the desk. Under it lay stacked notebooks tied with string, bundles of papers wrapped in waxed fabric, and one tin box with her father's initials punched into the lid. T.E. Not Howard, not Caleb. Thomas Ellison. Ruth lowered herself into the chair behind the desk because her legs had suddenly stopped feeling dependable. For a long moment, she only looked. Her father had not been a man for sentiment. He fixed hinges, sharpened blades, paid taxes early, and answered direct questions with half an answer if he thought that was enough. But this room, these crates, his initials on a locked box beneath the ground, this was not accident. It was preparation. She untied the first bundle with clumsy fingers. Inside were folded papers dry as bone, names written in fountain pen ink, survey lines, receipts, notarized statements, and old county copies. The top page had a date from 1968. Beneath it, another from 1971. Then a handwritten note in her father's narrow script. If these are ever opened, read in order, truth is useless when handled carelessly. Ruth sat in that hidden room under the woods with the lantern light trembling across the desk, and for the first time since she was thrown out of her house, she forgot to feel sorry for herself. Ruth did not touch everything at once. She forced herself to follow the note exactly as written, read in order. Truth is useless when handled carelessly. That sounded so much like her father that for a moment she could almost hear him saying it without looking up from a workbench. The first ledger was not dramatic. Names, dates, parcel numbers, acreage, tax amounts. But after 10 minutes, a pattern began to emerge. The same 6 family names appeared again and again beside small tracts along the western ridge. Payments marked received in one column were marked delinquent in another. Notes written in the margins changed hands across the years. Paid in full, receipt issued, then later, subject to seizure, default confirmed. It was not sloppiness, it was duplication. One record for the people who paid, another for the courthouse. Ruth set that book down and opened the next. This one was worse. Payroll sheets from a quarry that had closed before her children were born. Wages withheld. Company script deducted twice. Signatures of men and women who had worked 60-hour weeks and still ended each month owing money on paper. Tucked inside were handwritten statements, each one witnessed, each one naming the same local law office that had helped workers sign agreements they could not properly read. Ruth knew the surname on those papers, Barron. It still sat on bank buildings, campaign signs, and the brass plate outside the largest office in Belmere. She felt something cold move through her, colder than the air in the dugout. She opened another bundle. This one held maps, old county plats, and mineral rights surveys. Red pencil lines had been drawn through land that once belonged to black families and poor white families both, then redrawn to flow cleanly into holdings that later became Barron Timber and Ridgecrest Development. At the bottom of one map, in her father's writing, were 6 words: original boundaries before fraudulent consolidation. Ruth stared at that sentence for a long time. Her father had not hidden old family keepsakes under the ground. He had hidden evidence. She reached for the tin box with his initials and found the latch still stiff but working. Inside were 2 sealed envelopes, 3 small notebooks, a courthouse receipt, and a cloth pouch containing brass keys she did not recognize. One envelope had no name on it. The other did. For Ruth Ellison, if opening becomes necessary. Her throat tightened so suddenly it hurt. She sat straighter, broke the brittle seal carefully, and unfolded the pages inside. Her father's handwriting had not changed. Narrow, controlled, meant to say only what needed saying. Ruth, if you are reading this, then either I was right to keep these hidden, or I was wrong to think I would have time to explain. I pray for the second, but I prepared for the first. You must understand 3 things before you do anything. First, these papers were gathered because records were being altered. Not rumored, not guessed. Altered. Men who paid for land lost land. Men who signed wages never received wages. Families were forced off ground they had already bought. Some were cheated by tax notice, some by forged widow's marks, some by courthouse fire that seemed always to spare the wrong drawers. Second, I did not begin this work alone. Your mother knew enough to be afraid. Reverend Cato knew more. Alma Vickers carried copies in flour sacks before there was this dugout. Eli Turner was beaten for refusing to sign away survey lines. I write these names because if I am gone, the record should still remember who had courage. Third, do not hand the full set to one lawyer, one judge, one office, or one newspaper, unless they have first proven they cannot be bought, delayed, or frightened. Ruth paused and looked up into the dark dugout as if someone might be standing there listening. Below that, the letter turned more personal. I I put the West Tract in your name because it stayed outside Howard's business and outside county notice as much as possible. Do not think I did it for sentiment. I did it because paper survives only when tied to a living person who is harder to erase than a box in a storeroom. At the bottom of the second page was the line that made Ruth cover her mouth with one hand. If you have been driven there by loss, then loss has done one decent thing in your life and led you to the truth. She lowered the pages slowly. It was the closest thing to tenderness her father had ever written to her. The 3 small notebooks in the box were index lists. Who held copies, which parcels connected to which false transfers, which officials had signed things they could not have legally signed on those dates. One page contained nothing but descendants, updated in her father's hand as far as he had managed. Children, nieces, surviving wives, last known towns. He had not only preserved the theft, he had spent years tracking who had inherited the right to know about it. Ruth let out a breath she had not known she was holding. The dugout no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a fuse waiting for flame. She climbed back to the cabin only when the lantern burned low. Evening had already dropped across the trees. She locked the hatch, dragged brush back over part of the entrance, then stood in the yard trying to steady herself. 9 months ago, she had been making Howard soup and sorting his blood pressure pills. Yesterday, she had been evicted like worn furniture. Now she knew that beneath her father's land lay proof that half the county's respectable history had been built with theft. Inside the cabin, she spread only 4 selected documents across the table. 1 altered ledger page, 1 wage sheet, 1 survey map, and her father's letter. Not the whole truth, just enough to prove there was one. Then she took out a clean notebook from her bag and wrote a single list. Who can be trusted? Who must never know first? Who is still alive? By the time the fire sank low, Ruth had stopped feeling like an old woman with nowhere to go. She felt like a witness. Ruth waited 2 full days before taking a single page off the land, not because she was afraid of what she had found, but because her father had been precise. Do not hand the full set to 1 lawyer, 1 judge, 1 office, or 1 newspaper unless they have first proven they cannot be bought, delayed, or frightened. That was not the advice of a suspicious man growing old. It was the instruction of someone who had already watched records disappear once. On the 3rd morning, she drove into Belmere with 4 copy pages in a manila envelope, and the originals hidden back at the cabin in a flour tin beneath the floorboards. She parked 2 streets off Main, not in front of any office that carried a polished brass nameplate, and walked to the public library annex, where county records had been partly digitized and mostly ignored. The local archivist there was a narrow-shouldered woman named Lena Pritchard, 60 if she was a day, with steel gray hair pinned too tightly and the habit of reading over her glasses when people lied to her. Ruth asked for a private table. Lena said no one got one unless they had a reason. Ruth slid the altered ledger page across first. Lena looked at it for maybe 10 seconds before her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for Ruth to know she was seeing what mattered. Where did you get this? Before I answer that, Ruth said, I need to know whether you still believe county records are as clean as they look online. Lena said nothing. She reached for the wage sheet, then the survey map. She read the names twice. When her finger stopped on the barren notation, she leaned back in her chair and let out a breath through her nose. I've seen gaps, she said at last. Deed books with page numbers skipped, tax rolls that jump 3 years without explanation, families vanishing from land maps even when census records place them there. I could never prove alteration, only absence. She looked up. You have more. Yes. How much more? Enough to bury people who thought the ground was already theirs. Lena's mouth tightened, though not in disapproval, in concentration. Then you do not bring it to the county first, she said, and you do not speak to anybody carrying the Barron name, the Kale name, or anyone from Hester and Flint. Ruth felt something inside her settle. Not relief, confirmation. So you do know who can't be trusted. In Belmere, Lena said. A person survives by learning that before they need it. By noon, they had done only one thing, but it was enough. Lena checked the parcel number on Ruth's copied map against a microfilmed county plat. The original boundary matched Ruth's version, not the current one. More than that, the microfilm entry carried a handwritten revision mark from 3 years later with no supporting transfer attached. That should not have been possible, but there it was. A wound in public view if one knew where to look. Lena wrote down the name of a legal aid attorney in Dalton, 40 miles away, one who had built a reputation on contested title and elder displacement cases. Not local, she said. That matters. And before you show him much, ask him one question. What question? If the county clerk requests immediate possession of physical evidence for preservation, what do you do? Ruth understood at once. A good lawyer would answer, refuse without chain protections. A careless or compromised one would start talking about cooperation. She drove to Dalton that afternoon. The attorney's name was Gabriel Sloan. Mid-40s, rumpled suit, office above a pharmacy, not enough polish to be vain, and too much paperwork to be lazy. Ruth asked the question exactly as Lena had phrased it. He did not answer quickly. I refuse, he said. I inventory what exists, create controlled copies, place originals in separate custody, and establish record of possession before any county hand touches them. Ruth nodded and handed him only the 4 pages. He read in silence, then asked for a second look at the wage sheet. These signatures, he said quietly, if real, this is not just land fraud. This is labor theft tied to title transfer. Keep reading. He did. By the time he finished, the room had gone still. Mrs. Ellison, he said, if what you're implying is backed by a larger record, you may be sitting on the kind of evidence that reopens more than one case at once. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. I was thrown out of my house with 2 bags and my medicine in a shoebox. I am past being impressed by large words. Tell me what happens next. He almost smiled at that, but didn't. Next, I verify without exposing the source, quietly. I'll need parcel references, selected dates, and enough names to test the chain. Not the whole archive, not yet. Ruth gave him 3 names from her father's notebooks. One belonged to a dead quarry worker. One to a widow whose Mark had apparently transferred 12 acres she had never agreed to sell. The third was Alma Vickers. Gabriel looked up sharply. Vickers as in Moses and Alma Vickers? You know them? I know their grandson. He's been contesting a denial of family rights on ridge property for 6 years. Ruth felt the pieces move then. Not all of them, just enough to hear the mechanism under the floor start turning. When she stepped out of Gabriel's office, her phone was vibrating in her coat pocket. She stopped cold on the sidewalk. Almost no one had that number. Caleb. She let it ring, then ring again. A voicemail appeared before she reached the car. She played it only once. Ruth, I don't know where you are, but people are asking questions about Howard's old papers and the West Tract. If you found anything out there, you need to call me before this gets complicated. Howard's old papers. Not your welfare, not your health, not whether you were alive in a broken cabin with no proper heat. Papers. Ruth deleted the voicemail and sat behind the wheel with both hands still on the steering wheel. Her heart did not race. It hardened. By the time she reached the cabin, she already knew 2 things. First, someone had connected her disappearance to the land faster than they should have. Second, whatever she had uncovered was no longer resting safely in the past. That evening, before dark, she checked the hatch. Untouched. Then she walked the property line and found tire tracks near the lower gate that had not been there yesterday. Not deep. Not fresh enough to panic over. Fresh enough to matter. Ruth did not sleep much that night. Not because of the woods. By now she preferred the woods to people. Trees made noise, honestly. People rarely did. She lay awake on the cot with her father's notebooks stacked beneath the bed and listened to the cabin settle around her. Twice she got up to look through the front window. No headlights, no movement. Just moonlight on the pines and the faint shine of the lower gate where the strange tire marks had cut through the mud. At first light she drove to Dalton again, this time with copies of 12 more pages sealed in 2 separate envelopes. Gabriel had told her not to carry everything together, so she did not. Half went in her handbag. Half stayed hidden under the spare tire in the Buick. Ruth had spent most of her life being practical for ordinary reasons. Now she was practical for survival. Gabriel read fast, then slower, then stopped altogether when he reached the widow's affidavit and the mineral rights ledger attached to it. This is enough to move, he said. Move how? Quiet filings first, preservation notices, a protective petition tied to your eviction too, because I'm starting to think that was not as separate from this as it looked." Ruth did not blink. "I already knew that." He nodded once. "There's someone else you need to meet. Marcus Vickers, Alma Vickers' grandson. He's careful, angry, but careful. He spent years trying to prove his family was stripped of ridgeland through forged tax default. If these records say what they appear to say, his family wasn't mistaken. They were robbed." They met Marcus that afternoon in the back room of a feed store outside Dalton, because Gabriel trusted the owner and because Ruth had stopped expecting justice to begin in respectable offices. Marcus was in his 30s, broad-shouldered, quiet, with the kind of stillness that did not come from calm, but control. He looked at Ruth first, then at the copied affidavit in her hand, then back at Ruth again. "My grandmother used to say there was a second set of books," he said. Nobody believed her at the end. Ruth slid the page across. He read the signature twice. Alma Vickers, witnessed by Thomas Ellison and Reverend Cato. When Marcus lifted his eyes again, they had changed. Not softer, deeper. "She told the truth," he said. "Yes." He sat down hard in the chair behind him, as if his knees had decided for him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus asked the only question that mattered. "How many families?" Ruth answered honestly. "More than I know yet. Fewer than deserve it." From that point, things accelerated. Gabriel prepared notice packets to lock down selected parcels before rumor could outrun paperwork.
Lena began cross-checking names from Ruth's father's descendant lists against church books, obituaries, school records, and cemetery registries. Marcus started making calls, but only to people whose names his grandmother had once spoken without caution. By evening, they had identified 4 living descendants tied directly to the ledgers. By the next afternoon, it was 7. Then, someone entered the cabin. Not while Ruth was inside. Not because they were brave. Because they thought she would be away longer. She returned just before dusk with 2 bags of groceries and saw the front door sitting a half-inch wrong in its frame. Not wide open. Worse. Carefully closed by someone who wanted delay more than discovery. Ruth put the grocery bags down on the porch without a sound and stepped back. The kitchen window on the left had a new scrape mark near the latch. She did not go in. She walked back to the car, drove half a mile down the road, and called Marcus from the payphone outside an old bait shack because her own line no longer felt like hers. He arrived in 20 minutes with Gabriel behind him in a separate truck. They entered together. Drawers had been opened. The mattress slit. Floorboards near the stove pried up. The flour tin was gone. Ruth stood very still in the middle of the room and felt the absence like a hand around her throat. Then Marcus lifted the loose board beneath the washstand, exactly where Ruth had moved the originals that morning before leaving. The tin was still there. Gabriel looked at her. "You expected this." Ruth nodded. "I expected greed. I only didn't know how quickly it would arrive." The missing flour tin from beneath the stove had been filled with old seed catalogs and church bulletins. The intruder had taken the decoy. Marcus let out one sharp breath that was almost a laugh. "They thought they were ahead." "They still might think so," Ruth said. "Let them." That night, they did not merely celebrate being right. They worked. Gabriel arranged for 3 sealed evidence packets to be stored in 3 different places under 3 different names. Lena received one set through the library courier system the next morning. Marcus hand-delivered another to a retired judge in Chattanooga who owed his grandmother a debt from 40 years back. Ruth kept nothing complete in the cabin anymore, only fragments that were useless without the rest. By noon the next day, the first direct pressure arrived. A man in a county truck came to the gate asking polite questions about historical materials that might need to be safeguarded centrally. Ruth spoke to him through the screen door and told him he could leave before she called legal counsel. He left smiling too easily. An hour later, Caleb called again, voice tight now, no longer pretending concern. "If you're mixed up in something with that land, you are making a serious mistake." Ruth looked out toward the trees while he spoke. No, Caleb. The serious mistake was believing old people stop seeing clearly just because younger people stop seeing them at all. She hung up before he could answer. By sundown, Marcus had brought 2 more names from the ledgers, both tied to families that had lost land, wages, and, years later, access to burial ground they had once maintained themselves. Ruth sat at the kitchen table with him, Lena, and Gabriel, pages spread in careful rows, and understood something she had not allowed herself to feel since Howard died. She was no longer defending only herself. What had been buried under her father's land was now moving from hand to hand, name to name, family to family. Not rumor, record. Not bitterness, proof. And once proof begins to travel, fear changes sides. The first story did not appear in Belmere. That mattered. If the first report had run in the local weekly, it would have been smothered by Friday under ads for tractors, church fish fries, and a full-page statement from somebody respectable calling the whole thing a misunderstanding. Instead, it broke 40 miles away in a regional paper out of Dalton under a plain headline that landed harder because it did not try to sound dramatic. Archived records suggest decades of fraud in Western Ridge land transfers. Gabriel had chosen the reporter carefully. Mara Devlin was old enough not to be dazzled by courthouse manners and young enough not to owe anybody in Belmere a favor. She did not get the full archive, no one did. She got enough verified pages, enough corroborated names, enough missing links in the county chain to state the truth without exposing every living claimant before they were protected. By noon, the phone started. Lena called first from the annex. 2 county clerks have already requested access to the microfilm room, and one of them hasn't set foot in there in 15 years. Marcus called next. My aunt got a visit from a man asking whether Grandma kept old papers. He was smiling too much. Then Gabriel called with the one Ruth had expected most. The Barons are saying this is a malicious fabrication built from incomplete historical materials, which means they're worried. Ruth stood at the sink while he spoke, looking out toward the pines. Good. But worry was not the same as weakness. By evening, the counterattack had taken shape. A statement from Baron Holdings called the records fragmentary, non-contextual, and likely mishandled. A retired judge, now serving on 3 local boards and speaking as if he were above the matter, told a radio host that elderly people under emotional strain are especially vulnerable to suggestion. One county commissioner said publicly that false hope was being given to descendants who did not understand the complexity of land history. Ruth heard all of it and understood the method perfectly. Discredit the documents. If that failed, discredit the people holding them. If that failed, turn age into incompetence and grief into instability. The next morning, Mara Devlin came to the cabin. She arrived in a dusty sedan with 2 legal pads, a tape recorder she asked permission to use, and the direct gaze of someone who had already done her homework. Ruth made coffee. Marcus sat in on the interview by choice, Lena by necessity, Gabriel by instinct. Nobody in that room trusted the world enough anymore to leave witnesses to chance. Mara did not ask Ruth how it felt to be old, betrayed, or brave. Ruth liked her immediately for that. She asked dates, names, when Howard died, when Caleb filed the probate action, whether Ruth had been informed of her independent rights tied to the West Tract during those proceedings, whether anyone had contacted her after the first preservation notices were filed, whether she had reason to believe her eviction and the land records were connected through legal counsel or known family ties. Ruth answered every question cleanly. Then Mara asked, "Have you been told, directly or indirectly, that you are confused?" Ruth rested one hand on the table. "Not in so many useful words. They say I'm grieving. They say I'm being influenced. They say I don't understand what I found. But what they mean is simpler. They mean I was supposed to leave quietly." Mara wrote that down exactly. 2 days later, the second story ran. This one named Caleb, not as mastermind, not yet, as a probate petitioner whose filing had moved through review with unusual speed, while connected counsel also appeared in older title chains now under scrutiny. That was enough. Belmere loved respectable cruelty as long as it stayed private. publicly linked, it became panic. Caleb showed up at the cabin before sunset. He came alone, which told Ruth more than anything he said. Men only came alone when they wanted to sound personal before matters turned official. He stood in the yard in a sport coat that did not belong on red clay, and he looked smaller than he had on the porch the day he put her out. Not weaker, reduced. "Ruth," he began, "this has gone too far." She did not invite him onto the porch. "No," she said, "it has gone public." His jaw tightened. "You have no idea what people are doing with your name. I know exactly what they were doing with it before. That was the whole problem." He tried another route, regret, or something dressed to resemble it. If mistakes were made in probate, they can be addressed. But this spectacle is hurting everybody. Ruth looked at him for so long that he finally stopped talking. "You took my medicine off the bathroom shelf in a shoebox," she said. "You told me not to make it uglier than it had to be. So don't come here asking me for dignity now that yours is leaking." He left without another word. She watched him go and felt nothing at all. The legal pressure, meanwhile, had finally begun bending the other way. Gabriel filed an emergency motion tied to Ruth's eviction, arguing that material non-disclosure and conflict-linked handling may have tainted the entire process that displaced her. Marcus and 2 other descendants filed preservation claims on parcels listed in the dugout maps. Lena and Mara jointly submitted a formal request for independent review of the county record gaps. What had begun as buried history was now paperwork moving faster than the men who once controlled it. Then came the hearing. Not the final one, the first real crack. The courtroom was fuller than the barons wanted, and quieter than Caleb liked. Mara was there. So was Marcus, wearing the same stillness he had carried the day Ruth met him. Lena sat with the file box on her lap. Gabriel stood at Ruth's side with 6 marked exhibits and no wasted motion. Baron Counsel argued unreliability, age, chain break, emotional contamination of evidence. Gabriel answered with document lineage, corroborated microfilm, map overlays, independent witness records, and 1 sentence from Thomas Ellison's index notes that matched a courthouse transfer irregularity to the day. Then the judge asked the question Ruth had been waiting for someone in authority to ask. If these documents are fabricated, why do they predict errors in your county chain that your own office has now admitted exist? No one on the other side had a good answer. They talked anyway. Men in suits often did. When court recessed, Ruth did not smile. She had lived too long to celebrate partial decency. But outside the courtroom, on the stone steps, 3 people she had never met approached her one by one and said the same thing in different ways. "My grandmother told us something like this. My father said the land was stolen. We thought nobody would ever believe it." Ruth looked at those faces and understood the real scale at last. Not just parcels, not just wages. Memory itself had been driven underground and taught to whisper. By the time she got back to the cabin that night, the fire in the stove had gone low. She fed it, sat down at the table, and opened her father's letter one more time. "If loss has led you there, let truth travel farther than grief." This time, she did not read it as warning. She read it as instruction already underway. The final turn did not come in the thunderclap. It came the way most real endings do, through paper, signatures, sworn statements, and one exhausted official after another, realizing there were now too many verified facts to keep pretending confusion. Over the next 6 weeks, the record review widened. Parcel chains were frozen. 3 historic transfers were formally flagged as defective. 2 families were granted emergency standing to challenge prior title loss. A labor claim tied to the quarry records triggered a second inquiry of its own. The barons stopped calling the archive fabricated and began calling it incomplete, which was how frightened men spoke when denial had become too expensive. Then Ruth's eviction case broke open. Gabriel did not promise miracles. He never did, but he proved enough. Caleb's probate filing had omitted material information about the West Tract, rushed notice timing, and moved through counsel with direct links to names now under scrutiny in the broader title matter. It did not mean every part of the old theft ran through Caleb personally. It meant he had acted inside a machine built by people who assumed age made easy targets and old paper stayed dead. The judge in Ruth's hearing was not sentimental. Ruth appreciated that. Sentiment had never kept a roof over anyone. The woman read the filings, listened to the conflict argument, reviewed the omitted property disclosures, then asked Caleb 3 questions in a row without changing her tone. By the second, he had started answering too quickly. By the third, he had stopped meeting anyone's eyes. The order came down 10 days later. Ruth's removal was ruled materially compromised. The probate action was reopened. Temporary possession of the house was barred from transfer until review finished. Separate counsel was ordered on all linked property matters. Caleb was not ruined in one stroke, but for the first time in his life, he had to stand inside the consequences of what he had done without hiding behind the word process.
Ruth drove back to the house only once, not to reclaim it, to look. It stood exactly as she had left it, in the ugliest way possible. The porch swept, the curtains changed, her peony bed gone thin at the edges where nobody knew how deep the roots ran. She remained in the Buick, with both hands on the wheel, and understood, with a calm that surprised even her, that she did not want to live there again. That house had held her life. It had not protected it. So when Gabriel told her the reopened action and linked settlements gave her a path to return, recover, or negotiate, Ruth chose the third. She settled for enough to live cleanly, enough to restore the West Tract properly, and enough to establish something larger than herself. Marcus and the other descendant families did the same in their own ways. Not every acre returned. Real life did not move that neatly. But rights were restored, titles corrected, compensation paid in part, and public acknowledgement entered where silence had stood for decades. In Belmere, that alone felt almost unnatural. The dugout was emptied slowly and carefully. Every crate was logged. Every ledger was climate stored. The witness statements were digitized. The names were read aloud more than once. Alma Vickers, Reverend Cato, Eli Turner, Thomas Ellison. People who had carried truth in flour sacks, church ledgers, memory, and fear long before anyone with a polished desk was willing to call it evidence. By autumn, the West Tract became the Ellison Ridge Archive and Trust. The dugout itself was preserved under protective structure, not prettied up, not turned into some polished attraction for weekend curiosity. It remained what it had been, a hidden room built because truth once had nowhere safe to stand. Above ground, a modest archive building went up near the old cabin. One room held the records. One room served as legal intake space for families contesting old displacement claims. One fund, quiet but permanent, was set aside in Ruth's terms for elderly residents facing forced removal, title confusion, or predatory probate. When the plaque draft came back, they wanted to name the place after Ruth alone. She refused. "Put my father on it," she said. "Put the others on it too. I found it. They carried it." So they did. On the first public day, people came in small groups, not as tourists, but as descendants. Some carried folders. Some carried photographs. Some carried nothing but the names they had been told not to repeat too loudly when they were children. Marcus stood near the entrance, greeting families. Lena handled intake. Gabriel kept ending up with 3 people waiting for him at once. Ruth sat on the porch of the restored cabin in a plain, dark sweater, watching the path fill and empty again. Late in the afternoon, Mara Devlin asked her whether she wanted to say something for the recorder. Ruth looked out toward the trees first. The same trees that had watched her arrive with 2 bags and nowhere to go. The same ground that had answered back when she thought she had lost everything worth hearing. Then she said, "They put me out like the rest of my life was already behind me. Turns out it was waiting underground." That line ran everywhere, but the better part came later, after the crowd thinned and evening settled over the tract. A volunteer from town locked the archive room. Marcus headed down the path with the last family. Lena carried the day log inside. Ruth remained on the porch a little longer, listening to the woods breathe around the fading light. She was 79. She had been evicted, dismissed, spoken around, and nearly erased. Now, at the end of the day, people knew where to find her. And more importantly, they knew where to find the truth.